Welcome to Cafecito y Calidad. I'm your host, Elizabeth Sanchez, licensed marriage and family therapist and certified coffee enthusiast. Whether we're catching up with friends, studying for a big exam, or grounding with a little caffeinated cozy goodness, coffee brings us together, it powers us up, and it gives us a reason to sit down and connect. Each week, I'll be sitting down with an inspiring entrepreneur to discuss their journey towards building successful businesses and the mental wellness tools they use to alleviate burnout. But first, let's take a sip of something warm and comforting, shall we? You all probably know by now, I'm a first-generation Latina entrepreneur who is a big supporter of women-owned businesses. This is why finding El Cielito was such a special discovery for me. This online coffee company is led by the inspiring, warm-hearted, and hilarious social media star Daniel Oliveras, and they specialize in crafting delicious roasts using coffee beans from women-owned farms in Latin America. So why not try something new and support a great cause? Order from El Cielito Online Coffee Company today. Hello and welcome to Cafecito y Calidad. I'm Elizabeth Sanchez, licensed marriage and family therapist. On today's episode, we'll be discussing a topic that's particularly challenging for most of us, especially in the BIPOC community: imposter syndrome. If you're not familiar with imposter syndrome is that feeling of not belonging or not being good enough, despite evidence to the contrary. It's a common experience, but it can be especially difficult for those who have experienced racial bias and discrimination. Today, we'll be talking about the unique challenges faced by BIPOC individuals living with imposter syndrome and offering strategies for overcoming it with Lupita Martínez, a fellow MFT and a friend of mine. We'll also hear about the BIPOC individuals who have experienced imposter syndrome and have successfully worked through it. This is going to be an important and empowering episode, so let's get started. Lupita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So, Lupita, before we get started, I'd really like to talk to our audience about how we met and our story, and because many of our audience don't know that everybody that's on my guest on our podcast is people I really know and I trust and I believe need to be heard. So, Lupita and I met through our good friend Janet.
Mm-hmm.
She's also a MFT and she's also been on Cafecito y Calidad. So we met years back and we really connected around, I think we were talking about EMDR therapy. I think you were getting trained in EMDR therapy.
Yeah. Uh-huh. It was even before motherhood, right? I think we had met before motherhood, yeah.
Yes, we met before motherhood and we just always kept in touch. I've followed you on social media and all the work you've been doing around imposter syndrome has been really powerful, especially related to the BIPOC community. So, years later, turns out Janet reached out to me and said, "Hey, I know you're pregnant and Lupita's pregnant too. So I think it'd be great for you guys to connect around this pregnancy journey." And we did. And, you know, text messages and phone calls where we talked about the struggles around, working,
Mm-hmm.
being pregnant, entering this new role of motherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was also during the pandemic.
Yeah. The whole experience was bonkers. I think, at the moment when Janet connected us, I didn't think it was necessary. Like, I'm usually very good doing things on my own and kind of have my own little village. But Janet insisted and was like, you know what, like it's important. And, Janet has the experience with motherhood. And so I really took her advice to heart and, we connected. And
Mhm.
honestly, for anyone out there that's a listener and is a mom to be, it's so important to have your village, but to also even just create these new bonds with people that are also going through the same experience as you, because having you through my experience with pregnancy was honestly one of the best decisions that I ever made. And I mean, texting you at like 2 a.m. when we were breastfeeding or just talking about our insecurities as mothers or decision making, and more importantly, even just going into entrepreneurship again, right? Going back into our businesses as first time mothers was also something that we connected with a
Mhm.
lot. And so, yeah, I think it's really important for you to create
Mhm.
that village with someone that has that same experience as you, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that kind of leads into maybe our conversation today around imposter syndrome,
Mhm.
because ever since I've known you, Lupita, you've talked about imposter, how important it has been in your career, not only professionally but your own personal experience around imposter syndrome. So, can you take us down memory lane?
Yes.
And can we talk about what really got you into imposter syndrome?
Yeah, as soon as you said memory lane, I noticed my body just being like, "Yeah, let's chill. Let's talk
Let's
about this memory lane."
let's do it.
Uh-huh, yeah, so I grew up in Inglewood, but went to school in Hawthorne, and if people out there know where Hawthorne is, um, or like the Lawndale area, it's primarily brown and black folk, and so and Tongans and Samoans, but not a lot of white folk, right? And not a lot of Asians actually as well. And so when I was in high school, there was a lot of people that looked like me, talked like me. They just walked the same type of life as me, right? And so going into college, it was completely different, like a completely different experience. And there was so much culture shock and going into these big spaces, 500 people in a classroom, and you're literally one of the only one, if not the only one that's brown. Like that was such a huge deal. And being the only brown person in the room was just one of those things where it kind of plays on those insecurities of like, I don't belong here and I don't know what I'm talking about. Should I raise my hand? Should I ask a question? I don't want to sound stupid. Like all these different insecurities and like negative self-talk of what am I going to say and how am I going to say it? And so there's almost kind of like this doubt that you don't necessarily belong in these spaces. So that was one of my first experiences experiencing imposter syndrome, and I didn't even know that that's what I was experiencing until later, actually. Um, and so going into these spaces, being the only brown person, being the only female, especially in these science classes, like it was just really difficult. And I went and did my own work, right? I went to therapy myself, but there was just something there where I still felt like I was experiencing this on my own, right? Like I was in this on my own. No one else had experienced the same thing, and it really did feel like a very lonely experience even if I did have people that looked like me in my friend groups or yeah, it was just such a bonkers experience. And I think knowing now as a professional what I know, I've almost kind of made it like a very big goal of mine to make sure that all of my clients, when they do experience imposter syndrome, that they know like this is an experience that a lot of people experience, but they don't necessarily talk about. They're ashamed of, or, they may not necessarily just speak about it out loud. And so being able to just even normalize imposter syndrome is one of like the most amazing things that I've done in my career. And I do hope that a lot of the listeners out there just know, right? Like there's so much that you can do about yourself, but knowing that you're not in it alone is just it makes such a big impact.
And Lupita, I know you mentioned your college experience, and then going into, becoming a professional. You're a licensed marriage and family therapist. When did you like know you're like this is really what I want to specialize in? Because it really is a specific niche.
Yeah, yeah, and I honestly I didn't really know, because even as a trainee, like doing my hours, at some point I even wanted to work with the elderly. At some point, I wanted to work with teenagers and adolescents, and it really wasn't until I started to do my own entrepreneurship and like venture out into my own kind of new experiences where I noticed like the imposter syndrome was coming back again. And I'm like, oh crap, like, what am I doing? Like, I don't know what I'm doing. My parents were never entrepreneurs themselves. I don't know anyone who's an entrepreneur personally. And so there was a lot of those insecurities that kind of came up. And so knowing that, and knowing that I was still making decisions regardless, like I remember when I decided to go into entrepreneurship, it was literally like in a matter of a week. I decided in a matter of a week that I was going to start a business. I was working as a contract clinician with a colleague of mine, and he outgrew his office, and he was like, Lupita, like I have an office, I'm outgrowing it. I'm gonna leave this office on Friday. Let me know by Wednesday. This was like Tuesday or Monday of that week. Let me know by Wednesday if you're interested in taking this office because I could put in a good word for you. And so I'm like, oh shit, like what am I gonna do? Like I didn't even think about it. And I'm the type of girl, like obviously knowing my background, knowing that, I'm a first gen, like there's so many different characteristics to a person where as a first gen, you see like you're overthinking, you're like making sure you're dotting your I's, crossing your T's, you're over planning, you're doing all these different things. And so it was my first time, literally probably ever in my life, where I didn't plan things. I was like, okay, I gotta make this decision in the next 2 days. Am I gonna do it? I don't got this, I don't got that, I don't get this, but fuck it, I'm gonna do it. And so I honestly felt like that was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. And also, I feel like ever since then, I've been running my business in that way, in a sense, where it's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so there's a lot of like that fuck it mentality, right? Like, of like, I'm just going to do it and I'll figure it out on the fly or I'll ask questions. And so I've noticed that as I've been taking this mentality into my business, like I've met people like you or other people like Janet who have really just kind of created this community for me and have been super welcoming and super helpful. And I don't know, something about just being honest with people, like they're more willing to help you too. And so I'm asking all these questions and I mean, obviously, you want to pay for their time as well, sometimes as well. And so it's important to just, build that community and have other like-minded people around you to really provide that support for you.
So I think I can really relate to your story around entrepreneurship and imposter syndrome. Um, just even doing this podcast, the amount of imposter syndrome that I've experienced through the roof. Um, and it's one of those decisions that I also had to make on the fly. I thought about it. I went over it with my now producer Kai.
Ooh, name drop.
Look her up on social media. So I decided to I needed to take my business to the next level. I was like, what direction am I going to go? I have the clients, my practice is already established. What do I do now? And I was like, you know what? I have this wait list of clients and I can't see them all, right? And they need support. And, Lupita, I'm sure you can connect to this where other therapists are flooded, right? They're
Yep.
they're flooded with clients. So I'm like, you know what? I think it's time that people need to hear, topics like this, like imposter syndrome. So I spoke with Kai and I was like, you know what? Let's do a podcast. I didn't think much about it. I was like, we have some really good information to share. I have some amazing colleagues like yourself. And I'm like, let's do it. Let's make mental health more accessible to our community, especially the BIPOC community. So we did it. And I think it's been an amazing experience. But the imposter of after every episode, Lupita, my drive home, I could have done this. I should have done
Mhm.
that. Um, I like the negative self-talk is through the roof. And it's something that I'm still working on, but it's been a challenge, but I don't regret it. I don't regret it. And I ask questions like yourself along the way to colleagues and my team who is super knowledgeable. I hear them talk all the time and I'm like, I don't even know what you're saying, but
Yeah, even
you are
behind the scenes, like I
behind
was
the
learning
scenes,
so much. Yeah.
right? Even within 5 minutes, you're like, what is that? And
Yeah.
what? Yeah. So I think part of my experience as an entrepreneur is really needing to be vulnerable and being able to acknowledge like I don't have it all together and I do need help and being comfortable with asking for that help. And it seems like that's kind of been your journey when you first started your practice
Mhm.
and going into your entrepreneurship. Yeah.
Yeah, and even like with this whole idea of imposter syndrome, right? Like people come to me and they ask me questions, but I honestly like I know like anyone who even sees themselves as an expert, like there's still room to grow, right? There's still room to
Always.
learn. There's still room to read, to do all these different things. So when people come to me, like I only know so much, right? And I don't have this need to like feel like I need to know it all. And so even when it comes to imposter syndrome, like there's so many other colleagues out there. Like there's Stevon Lewis, he's a therapist out there as well, who does, a lot of work on imposter syndrome as well. And then there's Dr. Orby Austin in like the East Coast, who's also great when it comes to imposter syndrome too. So there's a lot of us out there, or maybe not as much as we would like, but knowing that, yes, I'm talking about it, but there's also, other therapists. Like I'm sure within your practice, you're also working on imposter syndrome with your clients as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things, and I see you doing it a lot right now, Lupita, is connecting with other colleagues and other therapists.
Hmm.
And I think that's been huge for me in working through my imposter syndrome is having a good sense of community, such as yourself, such as Janet, Juana, who was also on our podcast. So having a good community, being able to reach out and, having people to get feedback, constructive criticism, right? And know that you're not alone in this process.
And even just like being able to shoot the shit, right? Like being able
Yeah.
to just talk and be chill and humanize yourself within other people that are in your career as well. Cause we sometimes view therapists as being these people that wear cardigans that are just kind of like, like, oh, so how do you feel now? And so being able to just be my authentic self outside of the office and even in the office, because my clients know I will cuss, like I will do all the things. Like you see me just the way that my clients see me. I'm smiling, like I cry with my clients, like it's okay. And so being able to be your authentic self around people is definitely something that I even encourage a lot of my clients to be. 'Cause it's like, yes, I feel like it's great to be able to code switch, but at the same time, and we do it right because of survival. Like we need to know how to code switch. And so that's a great asset to have, but sometimes I feel like it's a huge responsibility as well. And so being able to, at least for myself, like I have the privilege to now be in a space where I don't necessarily need to code switch if I don't want to, right? Because I'm here with you as a professional, but I also don't necessarily want to be this person that wears a cardigan and feels very inauthentic, right? So I'm here in my docs. I'm like sitting crisscross applesauce, and I don't know who the hell still says crisscross applesauce, but it's one of those things where I just want to make sure that I want therapy to feel approachable. Like I want therapy to be like something that doesn't feel scary. So one of the things that I enjoy doing is working with people that have never been in therapy because I want to make sure that I bring that impression, especially as their first impression.
So Lupita, jumping into maybe your work with clients specifically, what are some of the tools, techniques, or even advice that and I'm going to take back advice, but like, what are some of the tools and techniques that you do use with your clients around imposter syndrome? I know you've worked with the young working first gen professionals, right?
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of the people that come into my office are usually first gen, usually, primarily females to be quite honest, but that's probably because I'm also a female therapist. But I see a lot of brown, black folk that come in and they're young professionals. They're for freaking badasses, right? Like they do so much great work out in the community, whether they're creatives of some sort or they're in the media or they're in like, big corps. Um, but they come in and so what we work on a lot of the times is boundary setting when it comes to having that work life balance. And I know it's not a cookie cutter kind of experience because some people do have to work long hours, but being able to just even find like this sense of autonomy outside of your job, right? Because a lot of times we get so invested in our jobs and we forget who we are outside of our jobs, and it's almost kind of like we connect with our business or we connect with our jobs, and that's what we measure our worth with, right? Like if I excel at this job, then that means that I'm worthy, or if I get this promotion, then that means that I'm worthy. And so being able to teach my clients that they're a person outside of their job is one of the things that we work on a lot. So making sure that they're still incorporating joy into their lives, they're still working on their hobbies, they're still connecting with, they're still connecting with, you know, friends, and they're still just being a human outside of work is definitely something that we do. Working on assertive communications. So if they, have a hard time speaking up, in a big meeting, or they're wanting to ask a question and they don't really feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to sound stupid asking this question. So we role play in session. We'll think about like, okay, well, what's coming up for you? Because usually a lot of the times when it comes to like perfectionism, when it comes to people pleasing, when it comes to imposter syndrome, it's all based on fear, right? Like
Mhm.
we have this fear of not being good enough, being found out a fraud. Um, and so knowing that that's the underlying feeling, we're working on that fear, right? Like, what does it mean to be afraid, right? How can I make my body and my mind feel like this is not unsafe? Like, this is safe, I mean. And so making sure that they feel regulated before they even speak. Right. So a lot of the times when we are working on assertive communication, it's not just about like, what am I going to say? But it's like, how am I going to prepare before I even say it? Like, how am I going to help my body feel like it can actually say what it needs to say?
And Lupita, I'm going to pause you there
Mhm.
because before we even started this episode, I called you. And can you share with our audience what you were doing to prepare for this episode in your
Oh,
car?
yeah, yeah, for sure. So I was she called me and I was like, "Oh yeah, hold on. I'm just doing a meditation before our podcast interview." And so, yeah, even for myself,
Yeah.
I think we were talking about how, or just early on in this episode, like we were talking about motherhood, right? And for me,
Yes.
I feel like coming back as a professional after motherhood, it's a little cobwebby up there. And so it felt really hard. Like I felt like I had to do a lot of like putting myself back out there when it comes to my educational or like self-care, right? We talk about social self-care and physical and emotional, but even intellectual self-care. Like I feel like that was kind of an afterthought for me. So doing the meditation before seeing you kind of put me in this mindset of like, you know what? Like, I don't need to know it all. I don't need to be able to know what I'm going to say. I literally looked over the questions like 5 minutes before coming in here. And I feel like before, as a professional, probably as a, like, when I was a trainee, I probably over, I probably over prepared, and did all the stuff to try and figure it out. Um, but yeah, it's been really nice and a huge relief to be able to not have to prepare for things like that.
Thank you, Lupita, for sharing that. Yeah, I know you were meditating. The reason I share that is because I know that you practice what you preach, right?
Yeah, for
And,
sure.
right. And, so I can speak to that. I was driving to the office and I was like, you know what? I recorded my voice, I recorded my intro, and I was like, am I overly preparing for this? And you know what I did? I put some Karol G.
Oh,
And I started
yeah, there
just
you
to move
go.
my body and I just was like, you know what? Like that's how I regulate. That's how I regulate my system, like it's through music
Music.
and through dance and through exercise. So I was like, you know what? I have the script with me. I have my questions. I'm having a really cool conversation with my good friend Lupita. It's just gonna flow.
It's gonna go. Yeah,
It's gonna
it's gonna feel
flow.
good. Yeah.
It's gonna feel good. And even if we mess up, you know what? We showed up.
Exactly, exactly. So it's always just, I feel like there's not as much pressure to be able to show, like, if you can just, push yourself to at least show up, that's always just a win right there. And everything that happens after that, like, you know, great, things will happen, but if you show up, like, that's already, you did more than enough.
Yeah, so it sounds like that those are some of the things that you do with your clients is just even talking about showing up, Lupita, and taking up space, I'm sure.
100%. Yeah. So again, assertive communication, boundary setting, but also even when it comes to taking up space, right? And feeling like I do a lot of EMDR, and this idea of taking up space or feeling like you're enough is something that we work through, right? Because as in a BIPOC community, like you're being triggered by things that sometimes other people are not typically triggered by, right? Like I think I mentioned in college, like who else will go into a space and not see another person that looks like them in that room of 500 students, like, unless you're brown and black, like it's not necessarily going to be something that they experience. So, and it's not someone that's telling me like, hey, you don't belong. It's something that you see. And so there's like so many systemic issues that are constant triggers for the BIPOC community, and being able to learn to take up space and even reprocessing or processing this idea of being able to take up space or knowing that you're enough, like that's something that I am passionate about. Because yeah, like I mean, even your crew, I'm like, dude, you guys are all badasses. Like you're
You really are,
young, and
aren't they?
yeah, like they're young and they're vibrant and they have all these different things and goals that, as a 21 or 22 or 30-year-old, like these aren't the things that I thought about, right? And because it didn't necessarily feel possible at that time. And so being able to see it like now is just amazing. Yeah.
Well, let's go back to motherhood. I know that, we're having a really great conversation around taking up space, but I think we can tie it into motherhood because um, even going back into the workforce, right? Like being able to go back into our practices after our mind has been taking care of this little human
On
being on
survival.
survival mode. getting maybe 2 to 3 hours of sleep, right? Breastfeeding, and that being like, a 24 hours a day, 7-day a week job, and
Mhm.
now having to transition back into being a therapist,
Mhm.
right? And I I know that you had mentioned that you felt this, but I definitely felt it going back to work and like, what am I doing? Like you said there's cobwebs up there. My brain was mush. Like I was barely sleeping.
Mhm.
So I was like, okay, so where do I fit in now in the field of mental health when I've been taking care of this little person for the past 3 to 4 months?
Mhm.
Right. And
Yeah.
so I'm sure you can speak on that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think when it comes to my own experience with imposter syndrome, even now within this last year, like, or within these last 2 years, 'cause I think I just came back into private practice maybe about a year and a half, maybe I don't even, yeah, a year and a half ago. But I really do feel like it took me a really long time to fully feel like myself again, right? And I think or we both talked about this cobwebby feeling, but there's so much research out there as well as far as like, parents, especially like first time parents are very much on survival mode, the first year of your kid's life and maybe even after, depending on your experience. And so going into to being a therapist again was something that played on my insecurities a lot of like, am I the same therapist? Do I have the same knowledge that I had before, or did it somehow just go away? And so um being able to trust in myself that like, no, this information is stuff that I like worked on and I did for like almost 10 years of my life. Like, it's not just gonna go away like this. But being able to just work that muscle, and do a lot of the reading and do a lot of the internal work too, because therapists go to therapy. Um, and
We
so
do.
and so being able to do my own internal work too has been something that's been really helpful with my own imposter syndrome too, coming back into the workforce. Mhm.
No, I can agree with that. I had to go back to therapy. Well, no. I started therapy once my son was born.
Yeah.
I was like, "What am I doing? Who told me that I can be a mother?" Uh,
Yeah, because you even like I think I even told my husband at some point, like, or no, when we left the hospital, I'm like, Are they really gonna just let us take the baby? Like, is this our
um,
kid? Like,
can we yeah, I told my husband too. I was like, "Who told us that, who gave us that stamp of approval? You can be a
yeah,
parent."
yeah. Because even now, I think like maybe a couple of like I have this friend that I know from high school, and we DM each other every now and then, and she's a first time mom as well. And I self disclosed with her, and I was like, yeah, like sometimes I just still feel like a little girl, like I still feel like a niña. Like, why do they like? How do they know that I can be a mom? And so like sometimes I'm like, I still feel like a kid, right? Like, how can I take care of a little human when I still feel like a kid myself? And I told my brother that one time too, my older brother, and he told me like, yeah, I still feel like a kid too. And it's brought so much empathy because even seeing my mom, right? My mom had her first kid at the age of 15 or 16. And so I had my first kid at the age of 32, I think. And so knowing that drastic difference, it's twice her fucking age, right? And so even as a 32-year-old, like I didn't feel prepared to have a kid, right? Like even if I like planned it, even if I had read all the books and done all the things, like it doesn't necessarily, you don't prepare for that stuff. And so I grew so much empathy as far as my mom's experience because yeah, there was so much imposter syndrome when it came to me being a mom, being an entrepreneur, and then knowing that my mom went through this experience at such a young age, like that was nowhere in my mind as a 16-year-old.
Yeah, and I think that also talks to, the multi-generational trauma,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Because I felt the same way. My mom didn't become a mom until but she was young. She was
Yeah.
21 years old.
Well, we're still young.
Yeah, we're still young. We're still young, but she had me at 21. But also, when I was pregnant, and I think I shared this with you. I was like, I might have not, but something that I had long conversations about with my husband was like, still seeing that my parents did the best they could. But how do we now break those cycles? And that's why I spent so much time reading the books, taking the class. I had a doula.
Me too.
I had a doula. I took the birthing classes. I did everything. Well, that's right. Like, I wanted to be prepared. I had him. that all went out the door.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. But I think that was really important to me is that I did grow empathy with regards to my parents, because they are entrepreneurs. So
Oh, okay.
they were raising myself and my brother, running a business and trying to be young parents.
Mm.
And I'm over here like I'm gonna try to do everything because one of the things that I've talked about in the podcast is just not. I was raised by my grandmother.
Mm.
So I'm always like, I want to make sure that my son does get the experience to, just to have me and be
Mm.
it because I didn't have that. I didn't have that. So, but after he was born, it's like, how am I supposed to juggle this business, which was my first baby, and now juggle him being a wife, being a daughter, being a sister, and half the time I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah. And I think, we put this pressure on ourselves of
Yeah.
like having to fit all these roles perfectly, right? Again, imposter syndrome, right? We're trying to be these superheroes or these super persons. And so being able to recognize that motherhood and even entrepreneurship doesn't have to be like a solo experience, right? Like we're natural beings, or we as beings naturally are supposed to be in a village, especially as people of color. Like,
Mhm.
one of the luxuries, or not luxuries, one of the, I guess, main characteristics of a person that's,
Mhm.
a person of color. It's like we are a collectivistic culture, right? Like we thrive off of working with other people. We have our abuelitas, taking care of us. We have our tias. We have even like neighbors. Because at some point, like one of my mom's vecinas was my sitter, and so being able to like use your community for your advantage is something that when we're working on this like generational trauma, remembering that that's actually a strength, right? Like that's a part of our resiliency. Like we can do so much if we can acknowledge that we can succeed so much better if we continue to be a collectivistic culture.
And I think even doing this podcast, Lupita, as I've been planning the episodes with my team and I've always been drawn to having guests. Like I'm gonna have some solo episodes. However, I think I've been drawn to having guests because of that, that collectivistic part of me that I do enjoy being able to share space and
Mhm.
being able to have these really raw and vulnerable
Oh,
conversations.
it's a vibe,
It's
right?
a
Like
vibe, and it's what's gotten me through some of the most difficult
yeah.
experiences, right? That's why, I have found so much healing working with my team because it's so much fun. We joke around, as you saw before we
Mhm.
started, but yeah, I think it is one of our strengths.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, being able to recognize the resiliency part of our generations, right? And knowing that that was something that worked for them and can continue to work for us is definitely very important.
Um, Going back to talking about some of your work with clients, Lupita, could you share maybe in general what have been some of the most challenging, you know, case? I'm going to use the word like cases with regards to clients. Like obviously not really, talking about any specific client, but what have been the more challenging cases that you've had around imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to complex trauma or even this generational trauma, because both of them are different but similar, the same, right? We have generational, which means like we have our past generations experiencing the trauma, and then they've kind of created these defense mechanisms that they've kind of placed on us, right? Versus complex trauma is this one person is this one individual is experiencing multiple, experiences of trauma. And I think when it comes to just recognizing the layers that come with it is so difficult sometimes because you can't just work on the one thing, which is imposter syndrome, right? Like you can't just work on like, oh yeah, I can't really, ask this question at work, but it's like, well, how does the generational trauma or the complex trauma affect this one experience, right? I think that's been the hardest, and that's actually been the primarily like the majority of my clients. And honestly, I don't think that there's one solo experience of imposter syndrome. Theoretically, in my head, like complex trauma and generational trauma is a part of like how I work. Like I know for a fact that systemic racism, discrimination, generational lineage experiences, complex trauma, like all of that affects imposter syndrome for sure.
Yeah, and that's something that I can speak to as regarding my practice too with clients because we're both EMDR,
Mhm.
therapists.
Mhm.
And we talk about that complex trauma is so much more, it is harder to work through.
100%, yeah.
Yes, especially with the BIPOC community, right? Because like you
Mhm.
mentioned, there's just so many different
Yeah,
layers.
you're just peeling layer after layer, and you think that you're at the end, and it's like, "Nope, there's more."
There's another thing, and I hear that all the time. Like,
Yeah.
really? We just had an EMDR session. Clients, I just had an EMDR session. Here's another thing I have to now work on.
Yeah.
So I think this is also normalizing to our audience, right? That,
Mhm.
it's
That's commonplace,
it's a
yeah.
commonplace, and it does take 3 generations to break a
Mhm.
multi-generational cycle.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it
Okay.
takes 3 generations. So often our clients are the first ones that are
Yeah.
breaking it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really like to tell my clients too, it's like as you're working on breaking these cycles, like it is not your responsibility to reach perfection. Like your responsibility is just to get the fuck in my room. Like that's already breaking generational traumas, right? Like you're coming in here already, like, and you're allowing the space to be a space that is normalized. And maybe you talk about it in family, maybe you don't. Maybe you talk about it with friends, maybe you don't. But regardless, like you got your ass here, you're sitting in that damn couch, like that's already a huge deal. So again, we're not reaching perfection. We're not trying to get there. Like we're just trying to make little baby steps. Mhm.
Yeah, I like how you normalize that because you're right. They're coming into therapy. First of all, they're taking up space.
Mhm.
They're being vulnerable,
Mhm. Something
right?
that they probably never did before in their
They
lives.
don't know, right? And if they do share with their family members that they're starting therapy, now they're having to face possible pushback,
Mhm.
right?
Shame.
Shame,
Mhm.
right? Like todo se queda en la familia, right? This
Mhm.
idea of everything stays within the
The
family.
dirty laundry
The
stays.
dirty laundry stays within the family, right? Now having to do internal self-reflection. So there's just so many things that come with just starting therapy,
Mhm.
right? And I think that I want our audience to hear that because it's not just, oh, I made an appointment and, this therapist takes my insurance. No, like I'm really going in and I'm going to start really looking at myself
For sure.
and I'm taking up space. I'm sharing things I've never shared with anybody. It's a very like raw process.
I like that you're using the word raw because a lot of times after EMDR sessions, I'll tell my clients, like, you might feel a little raw. Like, it might feel like there's just a lot, you know? And so I tell them, like, just be gentle with yourself after session and, take it easy because, yeah, this is things that you've never done before in your life.
And there's another part of it. We're asking our clients to be self-compassion,
Yeah,
practice
self
self-compassion.
compassionate. Yeah.
And it's like, so we're asking them, we're asking them to do so
We're
much.
asking them a lot, yeah,
Yeah.
and even with that, right, like, that takes practice, right, and that takes a lot of, like, work even to be self-compassionate, because a lot of the words we use and have maybe even been placed upon us is like, "Oh, you should be doing this. Oh, I need to do that. Oh, I have to do that." And so this need to, have to, and the should, like, that language is so normal for us, right, like, "Oh, I should have gone to the store. Oh, I should have taken this test, or I should have studied for this test," and so even just being able to recognize that we're using that language and how it impacts the way that we feel about ourselves is important because when you're using those words, like so much guilt and shame and self-blame comes into like what you're kind of saying to yourself. So going into this, I think you've mentioned like right after you'd record a podcast, you're talking about that, right? And so even being able to recognize like that you're using those words. So rather than saying like I should have said this or oh, I need to do that, it's like, well, the goal is to do this. I would have liked to say this, right? A little bit more of a gentle tone to it versus I should have said this. It's like, oh, well, the goal next time is to be able to do that.
And Lupita, that's something that I'm working on is learning to be a beginner.
Mhm.
Right? Is because,
Mhm.
I'm expected, or at least within my experience, growing up, I was expected to almost, like, be perfect,
Perfectionist, yeah. Mhm.
perfect in everything that I did, and starting this podcast, I've met my match. Like, I don't know what I'm doing,
Mhm.
and those are some of the things I'm starting to tell myself, like, "You're a beginner. You should give yourself that permission. give that inner child a permission, and I'm gonna get emotional, to not be perfect, to be a
Yeah.
beginner, to play, to make mistakes, because it's something that was frowned upon, at least within my family, to not have it all together.
Exactly. And I think it's important to recognize that, right? Like where you're saying, like, that's my experience and no one could take that away from you, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And so when you're working with clients, recognizing like every client has their own personal experience and every client comes and they're like, well, no, but my experience is nowhere compared to the next person. It's like, well, I'm not here to compare traumas. I'm not here to compare stories. Like if you experience it the way that you experienced it, and you feel that it's somehow now affecting you, like that's what we're working on. We're not working on, someone else's trauma. We're working on yours. And so being able to recognize, like, we're working on your stuff and your inner child, right? Because your inner child needed whatever it is that they needed. And you are now here to be able to provide that to your inner child.
Yeah. Lupita, so comparison is also huge, correct? With imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And because, bringing it back to my experience, that's something I've been doing is there's so many podcasters out there,
Hmm.
so many therapists out there, people of color who are doing what I'm doing. And it's easy for me to be like, well, they're doing so great. Like I'm not
Hmm.
quite there yet. So that comparison, so that's something that I'm currently working on is learning to not compare myself.
Hmm.
Because I've been listening to a podcast the podcaster said it was something along the lines of comparison is the killer of dreams.
Mm. Is it Jen Sincero?
No, 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 no. I
Uh-uh.
love her. I love her. No, it's Lewis House.
Mm.
Yeah, I listened to one of his episodes, and he talks about that, comparison is the killer of dreams, and I believe that
Oh,
because I'm
100%, yeah.
every time I've done that, I'm like, should I continue to do this? Should I stop now because I'm not quite there yet? And I have to remind myself, no, like
Mhm.
it's constant work. I have to, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting that you're bringing this up because we're subtly kind of actually bringing up the 5 different versions or
Mm.
archetypes of imposter syndrome, right?
Okay.
Because you touched on imperfectionist, now you're actually touching on the expert, right? Like feeling the need to be the expert in these
Mhm.
things, and if you aren't the expert, then it's like why even try, right? And so a lot of people that experience this idea of the expert, um they may not even apply for like the job that they want. So they may not necessarily, do the things that they want to do because it's like, well, I don't meet every single thing. I don't check every little thing on this box. So I'm not even gonna try, right? And so they kind of just sell themselves short, which is one of the archetypes when it comes to imposter syndrome. Mhm.
Okay. Can you continue talking about all the other ones?
Yeah, I think we even brought up the super person, right? Or the
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
right? Like where
Yes.
you are trying to, be all the different things, all the different roles and excel in them. Then there's also the natural genius. We may have even touched that one as well, naturally too, which is the person that feels like they kind of they should know all the answers and they should know them quickly. And like they won't necessarily ask for the help. So I think we even talked about how, yeah, you should be asking for the help. Yeah, we're a collectivistic culture. But the natural genius doesn't necessarily believe that. And then the other one's the soloist. So the soloist definitely doesn't really ask for help, right? Like they think they could do everything on their own. And there's almost kind of like a sense of shame for asking for help. So you see that a lot. And I bring up the example of like, Latino men, right? Like I remember my dad, it would be really hard for him to admit that he was wrong or to admit, that we were lost. And so there was times where he may have a hard time being able to just recognize that, but also recognizing like when we ask for help, or when this soloist can potentially ask for help, like they recognize, or at least they feel like, okay, I maybe am not good enough, or, oh, all this negative self talk, when in reality, like, where there's so much strength in numbers. And I think even just recognizing now with my dad too, like, as he's developing himself, like, you can see that he's now like, hey, he reaches out to me and calls me for help, or reaches out to my brothers and asks them a question. And so you see how even within these individuals there could be some character development as long as you recognize like, okay, this is harmful behavior. Me having this pressure of having to take on the world on my own is not, it's not going to be productive for myself, and it's potentially going to, do some harm to my body, to my mental health. Yeah, as long as you recognize it and can do something about it is always important. But yeah, so there's 5 different archetypes that we kind of naturally touched on.
Yeah, I think we definitely touched upon as we were talking about our own experiences
Mhm.
and with our experiences with our clients.
Mhm.
As you were talking, Lupita, about your dad, I think it took me back to my experience with my dad.
Mm.
So, my both my parents are entrepreneurs, but I think with one of the things that I think I've learned from my just seeing my dad specifically in business. So my mom immigrated from Tijuana when she was 3 years old.
Mm.
My dad immigrated from Mexico, Querétaro, and when he was 18. So my mom was more acculturated to the American culture. So
Mm.
she went to school here. So she doesn't have an accent.
Mm.
My father did. He came at 18 and he struggled to learn English.
Mhm.
But somehow, and I've always admired this about him is that he was, you know, didn't s- didn't speak. He had a heavy accent. So my parents would always take us, my brother and myself, on his business trips, or just because they were in real estate. And he really didn't have know much English. So I'm here as maybe like I was in elementary school, and I remember an experience. He was trying to close a deal, uh, a real estate deal, and there was this white man in front of him, and my mom would always kind of translate for him. So my dad was like, "No, I want to try to talk to him."
Ooh,
Yeah,
yes. What
yeah,
a
I want to.
badass.
Yeah, I'm gonna try. I'm gonna do it. And I remember how this white man actually like was criticizing his accent. Like almost like, who
Yeah.
are you to be trying to close this deal?
For y'all listeners out there, I rolled because yeah, that happens so often.
Yeah, and
Unfortunately, yeah.
yeah, and you know what he didn't let it
It didn't phase them.
it didn't phase him, and he just, I'm paying for this property and I'm gonna do it.
Mm.
And now through his hard work, he has been able to make a name for himself.
Mm.
But it's like, and I think that's one of the things that I've learned from my own family upbringing is that you kind of just have to keep going.
Mhm.
Obviously, take time and reflect, but you just keep pushing forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's something that you're doing, right? Because
Yeah.
maybe they didn't have the opportunity to take the time to reflect. Because 'Cause I'm
Yes.
looking back at my father too and his experience and, he also, has an accent, but, he worked full time, he was the primary breadwinner, and just looking back now as a parent, like, you recognize how much sacrifice it is, and then he still made it to, like, his English ESL classes afterwards, and he still is able to speak English now and have an actual conversation with people. Like, that's so admirable. And having people like this white man and other, not necessarily even white, just other people in general. Sometimes it's our own people, right? And
Exactly.
being able to recognize like these people can potentially do so much harm, not just on the person, but generations, right? Because I'm sure it's something that's impacted your life.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's also what fuels me to continue
Exactly.
to do this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Because
you're able to take that hardship and do
and
something positive
fuel
with it.
it.
Mhm.
Yeah, because oh yeah, and I know he didn't show it, but I'm sure,
Mhm.
it affected him, but he never talks about it.
Yeah.
Right?
But that's why we do all the talking now.
But that's why we do all the talking. No, absolutely, but yeah, that experience, and I still it's so vivid.
Mhm.
So in my mind, but
Yeah, I've definitely can recall quite a bit of vivid experiences such as that one that
yeah.
definitely fuel me as well. Mhm.
Okay, Lupita. So I think it's a topic that we should address before we wrap up our episode is for our viewers who are currently maybe contemplating seeking help, and help meaning whether it's a support group, therapy, a life coach. Maybe we both you and I can talk about, what are some of the things that, how we were going to phrase this.
Well, like maybe what are the things that we can say about it, like touch
Oh, yeah.
on when it comes to those things, yeah?
Yeah. What are some of the things? So I think that we can both speak around maybe if somebody is maybe seeking therapeutic services we worded it really nicely. I forgot.
Yeah. So we were talking about, wanting to for those people that are contemplating starting therapy, like what does that look like? Where do they
Mhm.
start? Yeah, and I think that when it comes to being able to recognize, like, if you're contemplating starting therapy, I think it's important to obviously reach out for help, but know that it's trial and error, right? Know that, you may have to reach out to more than just one therapist, because I personally don't have a secretary. I don't know about you. So it takes me some time. Like, my goal is definitely to do a turnaround, response rate, maybe at like 24, 48 hours. Sometimes it hits 72, depending on if it's a Friday. But I do try to respond to emails, and I know sometimes, clients have told me like, yeah, I've never, like, sometimes I get ghosted, and I'm just like, dang, like, I hope that, and I know that this is really difficult in getting linked sometimes, and it could be discouraging, but knowing, like, just like even finding a primary care physician, like, if you're looking for your primary care physician or your PCP, and you're like, you know what, I didn't like them, they didn't have very good bedside manner, like, you're gonna go and change your PCP because you don't want to go and see them, like. And so that's really the same thing when it comes to a therapist, right? Like, you want to vibe with them, you want to feel good, you want to feel seen, you want to feel like you can ask any question. Um, and so if that's not necessarily the case, then maybe it's time to move on, right? And so being able to normalize that, but knowing that it's not that easy sometimes, right? Because it may take you a couple of weeks or months to finally get a response, or find a therapist that looks like you, or find a therapist that accepts your insurance, or, like, there's so many different barriers, right? And so many different obstacles sometimes, so it can feel very overwhelming. But I think as long as you can recognize, like, okay, this is part of the process, this is part of something that, I want to do for myself, because I know that I deserve the work. And so being able to kind of almost take it as a mission of yours, right? Like, this is step one. Like, step one is just finding 5 therapists. Step two is, let me, draft an email and send that email to all 5 therapists and see who responds. Like, do it in little tiny baby steps, because if you're thinking already, like, I need to find a therapist and I want to start next week, like, the chances can be a little slim sometimes, especially if you want to see a specific type of therapist, right? Like, EMDR therapists that are Latinas are so, like, yeah, and so, very minuscule number. And so there's so many different things there. And so being able to know what it is that you want, and being able to kind of minimize it into those baby steps can feel less overwhelming.
I was going to add also, some therapists have like a 15 to 30 minutes pushing it, but 15-minute discovery call.
Yes.
Yes. So
Yes.
really taking advantage of that to
Yes.
see if, you and that therapist is a fit.
100%, yeah. So, like, like, I have a discovery call, and just to kind of give you like an understanding of what I would usually do in my discovery calls is, we'll talk. I'll talk to you about, what my expertise is, what are the types of clients that I typically see, and then we also talk about, like, my schedule, the rate, how much you're gonna have to pay, and even just the expectations when it comes to what therapy looks like in my therapy room, because it might look different than yours, right? Like, for me, the first couple of sessions we were doing treatment planning, but by the first session we're already creating a treatment plan, and so it's very specific to those things. And so I can literally tell them, like, this is what your first and your second session are going to look like, and these are the types of homework that you're going to be receiving, so that you can be working on that homework in between sessions. And so there's a lot of things that, maybe I provide that maybe the next therapist doesn't provide, because they also do really cool stuff too. And so it's about asking those questions and taking advantage of those discovery calls, just to see what they can offer you, because you're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you as well.
Yeah, so really encouraging our viewers to have a list of questions written
Hmm.
out, concerns, things that they're maybe specifically looking for in a therapist.
Especially my BIPOC folk, right? Like,
Oh,
how many
yes.
BIPOC clients do you tend to see? Like, do you have experience with this? And so, you want therapists that have that experience, and that knowledge, because you don't want to feel like you're, a stranger even within that, because they don't necessarily know your experience.
And also, because I know you and I do it, Lupita, but if we're not a fit for, during that discovery call, we decide we're not a fit. A lot of therapists also provide referrals,
Yes.
referrals to other colleagues that
They may know.
They may know or might be
Mhm.
a fit.
Mhm.
So that can also be a question that you have down, like, hey, if we're not a fit, do you have referrals for other colleagues or other therapists that can potentially see me?
100%, 100%. And I may be creating more work for myself, but when you hit me up, if you're looking for a therapist and I'm not the right fit for whatever reason, whether it's age or expertise or whatever, I usually reach out to my colleagues and I say, hey, like I'm looking for a referral for this, and this, like anyone taking like clients at this time, because I know from hearing from the clients that do start on with me, like sometimes they reach out and they're full, right? Because sometimes the websites are not updated. And so you see, like you're already really invested and you want to see this therapist and you hit them up and they either don't respond or they're full. And so, yeah, if you reach out to these therapists, like when you're doing these discovery calls, maybe even asking, like, hey, do you know of anyone accepting clients right now who may be a fit? That way you're not getting that run around a lot, because you do see a lot of clients sometimes having that experience of having to do numerous phone calls just to find out that they're not taking any clients at the moment.
And some clients can leave really discouraged.
A
Yeah.
100%, a
And
hundred
and
percent
that's something we're trying to
avoid.
avoid, is
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes this is the first step. This is sometimes the first time they're calling
A
somebody,
hundred
right?
percent, 100%. And I mean, that's already challenging in itself, right? There's all these barriers because, first time in therapy, maybe ever, first family member ever, first generation ever. And so these calls can be very intimidating. And so we're trying our best to, alleviate those circumstances as much as we can.
Well, Lupita, we covered a lot on our episode today. You are so knowledgeable. You have such a huge heart, not only as a therapist, but as a friend. Even being able to join us today on this podcast to talk about, such a topic that's dear to our hearts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we want to thank you. But before we go, can you share with our audience where can they find you and what are some of the projects you're currently working on?
Yeah, yeah. So you can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, even. You can find me under Therapy of the Sun. So, Therapy of the Sun on all platforms, or Lupita Martinez LMFT. I'm the only Lupita Martinez LMFT in the world, I think. And so yeah, you can find me there. At the moment, I am working on doing online courses. So I will be doing online courses on imposter syndrome. So wait for it. It should be coming out hopefully either end of summer or beginning of fall of this year. So you can have access to this information as just at your own pace. Also, I'm currently accepting clients as well for therapy. So if you're looking for a therapist and you liked what you you liked what you heard, then definitely hit me up as well. Yeah, my website too, therapyofthesun.com. Mhm.
She is very interactive on all her social media accounts. So much fun. I'm always like, oh my God, what is Lupita up to? So she's very interactive with all her with her viewers, and you know, definitely follow her. And thank you so much once again. And for all of those of you watching, definitely subscribe to Cafecito y Calidad. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on YouTube and my website. So we post the episodes as they release at calidadholisticwellness.com, and definitely subscribe. So thank you so much, Lupita, and
Thank
it was
you.
so much fun.
Thank you. And yeah, watch those videos because I'm sure you'll see all our how we were vibing and stuff. I'm sure you'll
Yes.
recognize that.
All right. That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Yeah.